Okay, so this part now deals with absolute value inequalities. And this is the lesson that I did with you on that Sunday. It's either an absolute value less than or greater than. If it's less than, take the thing out of the absolute value and put it between. That's how you put something between that number and the opposite of that number. If it's an absolute value less than, take it out and put it between that number and the opposite of that number. And now the next step is to get the x alone. They're dividing by 9, so we're going to multiply everything by 9. Multiply this by 9. When you multiply this by 9, it cancels out. And multiply this by 9. Is the x alone? Yes, then you're done. It's between negative 36 and 36. Any of those answers will work. On a number line, notice it's in between. Absolute value less than, in between. 27. Absolute value greater than. Remember, this is the one where you make two equations. One of them is the exact same thing without the absolute value. Then put the word or, and the other one is the opposite. V plus 7 is less than negative 1. When it's an absolute value greater than, it's two separate equations with the word or. One of them is the exact same thing. I put that on the right. The other one is the opposite. V plus 7, instead of greater than, less than, and instead of 1, negative 1. Again, absolute value greater than, two separate equations. Absolute value less than, in between. All right, now we solve these two equations. Let's get the V alone. V is less than negative 8. Or V is greater than negative 6. Okay. Negative 8, negative 6, and just point your arrows in the same direction. Absolute value greater than, two separate equations. One is the same and one is the opposite. Okay, let's look at number 28. Absolute value greater than. Absolute value greater than. Two separate equations. One of them is the same. Put it on the right. The word or, and the other one is the opposite. Instead of greater than, less than, and instead of 86, negative 86. Get the x alone. Divide by 10. Or, and solve on the other side. Two separate answers, or two separate parts to the answer. Point your arrow in the same direction. Point your arrow in the same direction. Absolute value greater than, two separate equations. One is the same, and one is the opposite. Okay. Next one. Absolute value greater than. Well, the first thing I have to do is get this absolute value by itself. No minus 6, nothing else. So I'm going to add 6. always have the absolute value alone. In the last examples, it was already alone. Next, it's an absolute value greater than. Two separate equations. One is the same, and one is the opposite. And then solve each one. Okay. Divide by 5. It's not an exact number. 45 is 9 3/5, so if you want to make it a decimal, be my guest. Okay. And the other side. Divide by 5. And it's the word or in between them. Okay. Notice it was an absolute value less than, so I split it between two separate equations. Number 30 seems to be fond of absolute value greater than. First thing you do is get the absolute value by itself. This has to be by itself. So let's get rid of that 5. But the absolute value is still not by itself. It's being multiplied by 5. The absolute value must be all alone. So if they're multiplying by 5, I'm going to do the opposite and divide by 5. Finally, the absolute value is alone. And use your calculator. It's an absolute value greater than, so it's two equations. One is the same, and one is the opposite. Less than -19. And now solve each one. Get the P alone. Watch your signs. You're about to divide by a negative. That means this is going to change directions. And now I'm going to divide by -5. P is greater than 5. On the other side, -5P is greater than, 13? Again, I'm going to divide by a negative. This thing changes direction. Divide by -5. P is less than, I think your teacher wanted you to leave it -13/5. Or 13 over -5. Or -13/5. You write it any way you want. Or give them the decimal. 2 and 3/5. Okay? Make sure you have the word or. And if he wants you to put it on a number line, 5 is over here. And -13/5 is over here. Notice I point my arrows in the same direction. Okay, that one was a little trickier. It was a little more work to get the y, to get the absolute value alone. But I got it alone. First I subtracted the 5, and then they were multiplying by 5, so I divided by 5. It was an absolute value greater than, so it resulted in two separate equations. One the same, and one opposite. He didn't give many absolute value less than. That's always between.